All right, ladies. So here we are navigating this interesting time frame with our coronavirus issues and everything else. Um, the plan, like I said previously, is to go ahead and touch on some things that we would be doing here at the end of the year, which, while it is sort of new material, is going to help support some of the ideas from earlier in the year. And so I fear that some of these could show up as examples and things on the exam they give you. And so I want to make sure that we cover that. I also want to make sure that you realize that we really haven't wasted any time this year, even though we did some things that won't be on the exam truly. Because some of those things, like deeper evolution and ecology concepts, are so critical in biology that if you take any biology in college, it's going to help you to have had that exposure and to have done that. So keep that in mind too. Um, but without further ado, we've got plants. I usually call our unit 8 the lightning round because it's just this like one day of very different things, like a day of plants followed by a day of the human immune system or whatever. So we're going to take a similar approach. And the goal will be to really just touch on the things I think that are most important for us, and then also begin some review. Since the test we're going to take is pretty much free response, we're going to focus our review on free response, and we'll hope that the College Board is going to give us more information too as we move forward in terms of what to expect on those, and in terms of the types of free response they're going to use. Um, so this will be a little weird. This won't be our normal video because some of these slides I'm literally going to look at and then go, nope, let's keep moving. So be aware of that. And I'm just sort of going to do that on the fly here, and decide what I think is important and what isn't as we go through. So we do usually study botany a little bit. But one thing I'm pretty confident we can do is we can get rid of this first question, because that's really about plant anatomy, which I don't think we're going to need. But these other two are interesting, right? Because we have talked about transpiration this year. Uh, well, it was mentioned because of water potential. And so we want to return to that idea. And then we also have this whole responding to stimuli idea, which is pretty much cell to cell communication, right? Which was a big chunk of our unit 2, I believe it was. So we're going to get into both of those things as they pertain to plants. This is really fun. This was at Disneyland back when my wife and I went at the start of February, getting to meet Groot. It was really cool. Dude was like 8 feet tall and just kept saying, "I am Groot," to whatever. But that was a cool little fun experience we had. Okay, so let's dive in. First slide breaks down the plant kingdom, and I don't think it really matters. Let's go to slide 2. All right, so life cycles, I can see this showing up a little bit because if you recall, we did touch on life cycles when we did meiosis. And a plant life cycle is a very different thing than an animal life cycle. And I do believe that the College Board traditionally covers this as part of, I think, their Unit 3. So we do want to point this out to you for a moment. That is that plants use what's called alternation of generations. And alternation of generations is weird. It's very different than animals, where they actually have a multicellular haploid stage and a multicellular diploid stage that they alternate between. So instead of us, where we have a diploid organism and we create a haploid cell, our egg or our sperm, these plants are going to actually be a diploid organism and then a haploid organism, which seems really strange, right? Now we call the diploid plant a sporophyte, and that's because they produce spores. And spores are little haploid cells that can become multicellular haploid organisms. And so spores become a haploid plant called a gametophyte, and we call it a gametophyte because they produce gametes. Now, that word should sound familiar. Gametes are just like our sperm and eggs. So at this point, we can see fertilization, and that generates a new sporophyte. So let's take a look at a picture here. So This is a picture that kind of shows you what it's like in an angiosperm, which is the usual focus for AP biology. Angiosperm is just a plant that has flowers, right? And so in these types of plants that are a little more complex, it's not like two separate plants, a separate diploid plant and a separate haploid plant, but more so that you've got sort of this diploid sporophyte is what's dominant. That's the plant you would be familiar with, right, seeing at the store or outside somewhere. And then the gametophyte is actually just like a little part of it. So like you notice here, the female gametophyte is just this little portion, kind of almost inside the plant. And the male gametophyte formed this tube kind of inside the plant, but these are multicellular things. So we still see this strange, alternating between a haploid stage and then a diploid stage. All right, flowers, I don't think are going to matter. Yeah, but again, I mean, you learn the parts of the flower like in grade school, but I don't think they'll ask us about this now. The way they reproduce also would be sort of an anatomical, physiological thing that I don't think we need, but do recognize that, most plants carry male and female parts, and so you're familiar with pollen, I'm sure, whether it's an allergy inducer for you or something, but pollen is sort of like your male um, plant part. And then they also have female plant parts, which involve this embryo sac and eggs and things like that. So, we do have a little bit of similarity, although it's tiny, with how we reproduce and how plants reproduce because they still have that fertilization stage between sperm and egg. And we call that pollination. I don't think we need to know anything really about specific pollination, but one thing that's kind of interesting, I probably shouldn't have scribbled that out. One thing that's kind of interesting that I could see coming up is this idea of coevolution. So while evolution in depth is College Board Unit 7, and so it's not going to be on your test. They include in Unit 1 a basic understanding of Darwin's natural selection. So I do feel good about the fact that we covered that, and you guys will be definitely ready for any kind of questions with that. I could see it coming up that sometimes species will evolve together, right? And so that's what we do see in terms of pollinators. Um, a flower and an organism will evolve together, and this is a great example right here. What happens is these flowers will evolve to become longer and longer, or kind of deeper, so that this hummingbird is forced to really stick its beak in there and get some of that pollen into the feathers right around its face, and then it'll transfer that pollen to another flower. Meanwhile, the hummingbird will evolve to get a longer beak so that it's easier for it to reach, what it's looking for down here deep in the flower. So kind of an interesting idea where they will kind of mutualistically evolve. Yeah, don't worry about this. Seeds and fruits, I can't imagine they're going to ask us about either, but just as an interesting side note, sort of, basically once fertilization happens, most of these angiosperms, or all angiosperms, will form a seed, and then around that it will form this fruit that sort of protects the seed, or, as we'll see in a moment, makes it attractive to other organisms. Yeah, don't worry about this. Or this. Although just kind of fun to look at, but not something I don't think you need to know, is the way a plant kind of sprouts. Um, seeds can lay dormant and dry for a long time, and then they imbibe or uptake water, and then the little sprout pops out, and then what actually happens is it pops out, and you see this growth in this area, so it sort of flings the plant upwards, and that's what you get. A little more about fruits. Definitely don't worry about the different types of fruit that we see. Same thing here. Here's an interesting picture of bear poop. Again, a fruit might attract an animal to eat it, and the seeds come back out in the feces maybe far away and helps, disperse the plants. Okay, so now we have reached something that is quite important for things that we need to know. So definitely don't want to rush through these next couple of slides. So one thing about plants, probably the most common thing about plants that shows up on the AP exam is the concept of transpiration. So we want to cover transpiration. What's interesting, the reason I put AP Trickery up here is that the framework of the AP Biology course claims that you don't need to know about transpiration in plants, but if you don't know about transpiration in plants, a lot of times their questions about water potential can be really confusing. So we'll take a minute here to cover that. Transpiration sounds a little bit like perspiration, right? And it's sort of a similar idea. It's where water vapor, gaseous water, escapes from leaves on a plant. And this is a pretty important thing for plants. They need to be able to release water. Otherwise, they would easily get overwatered when it rains or in a planter on your back porch or something. And transpiration, believe it or not, is actually the major force that helps bring water up a plant. So you would think that might be more of a push because of pressure on the roots or something when you water a plant, but it's actually more of like a pulling force that moves up the plant's stalk. So transpiration itself happens through little openings called stomata. Stomata are cool though because they're really well controlled. These are some great microscopic images here on the right. This stomatal pore is actually between two cells, and you can see it really well here in this kind of cartoon picture at the bottom, that are called guard cells. Now, when there's plenty of water, right, so you might remember this term turgid, right, from back before. When there's plenty of water, the guard cells are full of water, they become turgid, and this kind of bows them outward. And so that's what you see like in this top image. And so this is an open pore, right? And again, that's because the plant has plenty of water. So the cells fill with water and it opens the pore and lets some of that water evaporate out. Now, as the plant loses water, these cells become more flaccid, and when they become flaccid, they sort of fall back closed. And that's what we see here. It's a little harder to tell here, but this would be a closed stomatal opening. And this is controlled not only by just water osmosis and those sort of ideas that we learned first semester, but also by a hormone called ABA, or abscisic acid. Abscisic acid actually will cause stomata to close if the plant starts to detect a lack of water. So basically, if the roots that are in the ground detect that things are getting dry, they will send this hormone up the plant and cause the stomata to close even before, the osmosis effects would get to the leaves and things. The roots can send this signal and close those pores so that it doesn't keep giving off water. Now, the movement of sap, right, in the xylem, which would be, up a plant from roots to stem to branches and then to the leaves, is the result of two pressures. Now, the first is what most people often think of, and that's root pressure, right? A positive pressure. If I got this plant here, it's a terrible drawing. A lot of times people think of this being the major force behind movement up the plant, would be this sort of push on the roots from water that gets absorbed. And sometimes this does cause this. A lot of times this leads to something called guttation, seen in this picture, which is where the little droplets of water actually leave the plant. And this is when root pressure is really strong, but that's kind of rare. And a lot of times people confuse this with just dew on a plant in the morning, which is more about condensation, right? But it's called guttation. But much more importantly, right? Much more importantly, the primary force that brings sap and fluids and things up a plant is transpiration. It's a pull, right? And so, more specifically, this transpirational pull of evaporation at the leaf surface is a negative pressure, right? Or AKA pull. And hopefully that sounds familiar because it's something that you probably don't want to talk about again, but it's never going away. And that's water potential. Right, remember these pictures from way back in first semester where one of the ways that we can actually cause water to move across a membrane, particularly in plants, is a negative pressure, a pulling force. So if we pull this piston up, we can actually bring this fluid around this little U-tube with it, right? So the movement of sap is often due to a water potential gradient. And so, again, to review, water potential is the solute potential plus the pressure potential. And pressure potential, in this case, we're talking about, a transpirational pull would be a negative pressure. And remember, negative pressure potential would lower the water potential, and water moves from high potential to low potential. So, in other words, the more negative water potential is, the more likely that's going to pull water towards that side. And the air-leaf interface at the top of a plant, so to speak, has a really low, really negative water potential. So here's a picture to sort of express this. And again, the big key is this gradient that we see, kind of from the roots on up. But what this side of the picture is showing you is that this is really a cell-to-cell thing, where the water potential is going to just get a little bit lower and lower and lower and lower. And again, when we say lower, we mean more negative, right? From roots up to that air-leaf interface. And so they're showing you those actual kind of values over here. Maybe the water potential from the soil into the root cells is negative 0.3. And then into the trunk of this tree is negative 0.6. So the water is going to flow toward that more negative water potential. And then maybe higher up in the trunk, it's negative 0.8. And when we get to the initial, kind of interface between the branches and the leaves, maybe that's negative 1. And then, those leaf cells just around those leaf cells, but still part of the plant itself, you've got these little air pouches inside the leaves. Maybe that's negative 7. And then check this out, right? The interface between the leaf and the air outside is negative 100. So this is going to be just a massive pulling water potential that'll pull water up from the very bottom of the plant. All right, so the next section is sort of about responding to stimuli. And again, this is really, a set of signaling systems. And don't let that freak you out. We're not going to get into specific receptors, signal transduction, or responses really. Or we're going to talk about responses here in a moment, but not really any specific receptors or transduction cascades or anything. But these are very similar to what we talked about first semester. Right, these are very, very similar to our G protein coupled type receptors. This definitely involves phosphorylation, so your kinase enzymes. They definitely use a calcium second messenger system, a lot like our muscles have. They tend to use what's called cyclic GMP instead of cyclic AMP, but it's all very similar. And it's primarily coordinated by a group of plant hormones. Now, the next few slides that you have, there's 5 or 6 of them, I think, go through some of the major classes of plant hormones. I've got a separate video for that. I made it a couple of years ago because that was content that I always felt like it needed to be said, but we didn't use class time on it because I thought it was kind of rare for that kind of thing to show up. I still think that's true. So I posted that separate video. I would not worry about watching that, on your online school day when I know you got a lot of other stuff to handle as well. It's possible on this test we're going to take that they have a question about cell signaling and it refers to a plant hormone, but I think it's much more likely that they're going to reference animal hormones. And so we'll talk about those here at a later date, and they're going to fit a lot more neatly into what we talked about previously in terms of cell-to-cell receptors. And then I got a great, if you've never seen Buttermilk, the baby goat, it's very funny. So check that out. That's posted on Schoology as well. Oop, I think I spoke too soon. In a moment, you'll have slides about the classes of plant hormones. First, just a couple examples, and we're not going to go into depth here about responding to stimuli. Phototropism is one. So tropism just means a plant responding to a stimulus or curving toward or away from a stimulus. So kind of fun here. Phototropism, right, would mean plants growing to or from light. And some of the earliest experiments on this were done by Charles Darwin and his son Francis Darwin. So kind of interesting. Later in Charles's life, he was looking at these botanical questions. But basically, scientists wanted to know if a plant is really just every one of its cells responding to light, or do some of its cells respond because of communication between plant cells? Now, what they found, so I switched here so we can look at these pictures real quick. What they found is that it's definitely true that some plant cells can detect light and others cannot. And so the plant cells that can detect light use a signaling system like hormones and like the cell-to-cell signaling that we talked about earlier this year to basically send instructions to another part of the plant. So what Darwin and Darwin basically showed is that it was, the tip of the plant that detects light. So if they cut the tip off, then the plant did not show phototropism. If they covered the tip, then the plant did not show phototropism. But if the tip of the plant was exposed, or if it had like a clear cap where the sun could get through, then the plant would grow toward the sun, right? And what's crazy is the growth appears to take place down here, right? But the light or the sun sort of response is at the tip of the plant. Boyson and Jensen came a little bit later. I don't remember these names for any reason, but basically they showed that it had to be some sort of chemical signal that was going from the tip down to the lower parts of the plant. And then a guy came along later named Went here at the bottom who was able to isolate that chemical, and he called it auxin, and that was actually the first plant hormone that was discovered as a chemical signal in plants. Now I think you had your slides about the hormones mixed in that you got to jump by. We're definitely not going to go into depth here, but just to point out that plants also, they have photoreceptors, just like we do, that detect light, similar to the things that are in your eyes, right? They're pigments and cells that can sense light, and so there's a whole field of what's called photomorphogenesis, which looks at how plants react to light around them. It's not just about growing towards light. They also do a lot of different things in response to light. Kind of matters what color that light is too. So again, don't study this, but there's blue light photoreceptors and there's red light photoreceptors as well, but I wouldn't worry about it. Same thing here. Kind of interesting. You probably knew this. Plants will grow and avoid shade, and there's cells, specific cells that help them do that. This is something I just want to point this out because this is kind of an overarching idea, and that's just the idea of circadian rhythms. I feel like it came up at another time this year already too, but circadian rhythm, if you're curious, and this could be plants or animals, is sort of an internal rhythm, right? We have our bodies and they run on a roughly 24-hour clock. There's some awareness in you, even if you're holed up in your basement during this coronavirus pandemic. where you kind of know if it's daytime or nighttime, even if you can't see the light outside. Um, and that's true, we think, for plants as well, that they respond to light. Like it's showing you this picture, they might actually even sort of stick their leaves up to catch more sun when it's, midday, and then they'll droop them some later in the day. But we have this built-in clock as well. What's really interesting is this clock is maintained through chemical signaling, but it's not exactly 24 hours. And so the way they figured that out actually is they studied some miners. They didn't do anything to these guys, but they took these groups of men and women who worked in like a coal mine, and when they had been underground for several days, their circadian rhythm would get thrown off. Basically, the body runs on like a 25-hour clock. And so what we have to do, or 25 to 26 hours, I got 26 here from your textbook, but what we have to do is we have to synchronize, right? So we have to, see light during the day, and then our body sort of recalibrates its clock. But if we are just in a basement or in a coal mine for a week, we'll start to estimate incorrectly, whether it's day or night, because our body's clock will get thrown off. And if anybody has ever, flown across a couple of time zones, you may have experienced sort of a jet lag idea, and this has a little bit to do with desynchronizing your circadian internal clock. When I went to Disneyland, like I picture at the start of this, it was really strange because, we left here in the evening after school let out, actually, and got there, and basically no time had elapsed because of the time change. And so we were there like eating dinner, and it was really, midnight to our bodies, and it really kind of messed with us for a couple days. And then of course we got used to it and then came home, and then that messed with us for a couple days too. Yeah, don't worry about this. But plants, there are different plants. It kind of has to do with which plants bloom in which season. It's all about photoperiodism, so all about how long day is and how long night is. Short day plants tend to bloom in like the fall or the winter, so things like poinsettias and mums are good fall plants. Long day plants are things that bloom in spring or summer, so a lot of our kind of crop plants that we would eat. And then some are neutral, so some things, doesn't matter how long the day is when they bloom. Kind of a fun, interesting thing here, although this is not something I think you're going to need to know for the AP exam, but for a long time scientists thought that plants were detecting how long the day is, but it's actually that they detect how long the night is. And this is a really fun experiment they did where they had these plants, and they would just literally expose them to like a camera flash in the middle of the night, and it would totally throw off their blooming schedule, because it would mess up their kind of internal calculation of how long night is. And a lot of times what you'll see is you'll see plants that get all screwed up like this on the side of a road, because at night they'll keep getting flashes of lights from headlights that drive by. All right, and the last thing is plant defense. I also don't think that this is particularly important, but I guess it could show up again as sort of a basic evolution example. Plants have evolved defensive mechanisms because they do have predators, right? I mean, think of it more as an herbivore, really, that would eat a plant, but plants can't run like animals can. So they've evolved different kinds of defenses that are both chemical and physical. Thorns would be a good physical evolution to help defend plants. Things called trichomes, which can have all kinds of different shapes. You see a cool image here. If you ever see a plant that's kind of fuzzy, it's probably a type of trichome, which just makes it so that an animal doesn't really want to bite into that, right? It's kind of uncomfortable to it, and so it's less likely to eat it. And then there's also chemical defenses, and I don't know that you'll need to know this for the test, but this is just a fantastically awesome example. I get almost as excited about this one as that fish that I like that attacks, from different sides. So some plants have just chemicals that make them toxic, right, or make them taste bad, and so then plants won't, or insects or other animals won't eat them and things. But this is a really cool example. So there's a couple different plants that do this. So it's not even a specific example, but what these plants will do actually is when they incur damage. So like when this caterpillar starts eating this plant, what happens is it triggers a signal transduction pathway. So basically, the saliva of the insect binds with a receptor, leads to signal transduction. This leads to a release of a gaseous signal that will attract these wasps, which are parasitoid, which means they're parasites of the caterpillar. And what they do is they lay their eggs in the caterpillar. So basically, biting this plant, by the caterpillar biting this plant, it sets off a signaling cascade that releases basically a call for wasps to show up, plant their eggs in the caterpillar, and kill the caterpillar. Isn't that wild? Again, the plant can't move, it can't really defend itself, so it has a way to like call in some defenders. It's just really neat. And then we got pathogens. So we're going to talk about pathogens just a little bit coming up after spring break in your immune system. But pathogens are a way, a fact of life for any kind of organism. So a pathogen, being something that can cause disease. So plants have to deal with pathogens as well. And very few pathogens are virulent. They don't tend to kill plants, but they weaken it, right? They kind of harm the plant. And a lot of times if an herbivore, bites open a plant somehow, then you get these pathogens in there. And it's just a couple cool pictures actually. But while you might not think it matters that much that plants need to have sort of an immune system, so to speak, or a way to defend against pathogens, realize that we rely on plants a lot. We rely on plants not only for oxygen, but we rely on them for food. And so an example is like the potato famine, right? Irish potato famine you maybe heard of in history class of the 1840s. If you get potato blight, they make these nasty potatoes, and if potatoes are a massive staple of the diet of a group of humans or a group of animals, it's a big problem if all the potatoes go away. So sometimes these things do really matter. All right, so I know that was still a lot of stuff, but that kind of bounced us through plants quickly, and we'll continue to kind of focus on just those things that are going to matter the most to us. So thanks for listening. I'll catch you guys later.